This morning, if you have your Bible, let's turn to Genesis 13. We're going to pick up with our case study of Abram and Sarai. And as we prepare to do that, I want to kind of begin with sort of an introductory question here. Because I guess if we had a title for this lesson, it's promises. We're talking about promises this morning. What has your experience been with promises? Often broken. Is Chris the only person in here who has experienced that? Or would anyone else say that?
I was going to say most people that in my life have kept their promises.
Okay, you've had good experiences with promises, okay?
I try not to make them.
Okay, why?
So you don't break
So you don't hurt Chris's feelings?
Yeah, I'd rather not put that pressure on myself.
Yeah, I had a friend.
That a lot of times you don't have any control
Okay.
or much control over.
Maybe something happened, you made a promise and you intended to keep it, but something happened, it didn't work out. A friend of mine always used to say he likes to under-promise and over-deliver. And I much prefer that to the opposite, don't you? The person who just has a bunch of promises, but as they're making them, you're thinking, I don't know how you're going to pull this off. So some of us have had good experience, some bad. Do you think, and this is just a thought question, do you think that our earthly experiences with promises may affect our approach toward God and His promises? I'm just wondering if that's possible, because I think we see that happening in other areas of life. Whatever, for example, whatever your relationship was like with your earthly father tends to color and influence your view of God, for better or worse. Sometimes that happens. And so I think we would be naive to think that our earthly experiences with fathers or promises or any number of things wouldn't affect us spiritually. But I want us to talk about promises this morning, and to do that we're going to go back into this story in Genesis chapter 13, beginning in verse 14. If somebody would read verses 14 through the end of the chapter, we'll talk about this for just a moment.
And the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward, for all the land which you see I give to you and your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you. Then Abram moved his tent and went and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord.
Okay, thank you. Last week we looked at Lot, took a little bit of a detour, and examined his family and his situation and his choices and some of the consequences of those choices. And so while Lot was considered righteous by God, 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 7 and 8, he certainly left us some good lessons as husbands and parents that we might want to learn from. So while Lot, at least in some ways, is seeming moving further away from God, geographically at least, Abram is reminded in this section by God of His promise to give this land to Abram and his offspring, implying that he will have offspring. And God even has Abram physically, if I'm understanding this right, physically walk through the length and the breadth of the land, verse 17, so you could get a more real sense, like this is a real promise. This is a real place that I'm promising you. I want you to walk through it, and every step of the way I want your faith in this promise to grow. And Abram's faith in God seems strengthened at this point. He builds another altar to the Lord in the place where he moved his tent and settled. And so the lesson that he learned in Egypt seems to have strengthened his faith. God shows up after Lot leaves and renews this promise that he has made to Abram. Is it important when people make you promises? Is it important from time to time that they come back and say, hey, I'm still going to do this? I haven't yet, but I'm still going to do this. That lets you know, okay, they're still intending on doing what they said. Some promises take a long time to fulfill. And this one was certainly going to take a long time to actually fulfill. And God says, I just want to renew this promise to you. So when we get to chapter 14, it's kind of a fascinating and exciting account of a war between two different groups of kings. And there's a lot of names in here that we probably can't pronounce, but here's kind of the gist of this, because we don't want to spend too much time on this section. But in this war, Lot, along with all of the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions, was taken captive by the winners of this war. Okay, there's this war between 5 kings and their armies and 4 kings and their armies, and Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah are caught up in this war, and he's taken as a prisoner of war, along with all of the other stuff and probably all the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. They're just, the spoils of war. And so somebody escapes to tell Abram about this in verse 13. And Abram has 318 trained men who grew up in his household, kind of like his own small army. And this is an interesting thing about Abram. We often think of him as just kind of this old wandering man in a robe who, maybe he's just, kind of an old Bible guy. But evidently, he's a very powerful, I don't know what the word would have been back then, sultan, chief, something along those lines. He's incredibly capable. And he's got this small army of trained men and no fear at all about what he's about to do. He takes these 318 men and he pursues this group of kings, the winners of this war. A group of 4 kings and all of their armies, and he takes his 318 men and pursues them. The Bible says in verse 15, he divided his forces against them by night, and he defeated them. And he pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Now, you might say, how could just a few hundred people defeat the collected armies of 4 victorious kings? And my first answer would be, I don't know, the Bible doesn't tell us. But my second answer would be because God had made a promise in chapter 12, verse 3. And you might remember this promise. God said, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you, I will curse. Didn't he say that? Could that apply to this group of 4 kings who kidnapped his nephew and stole all of their stuff? It certainly could. This is something that dishonors Abram, and Abram may be helped in a great deal by God in this way. He brought back all the possessions, Abram did, and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions, verse 16, and the women and the people. So him and his 318 men are very successful. They win this excursion, and they retrieve Lot and all of his stuff. And again, there's no mention of his wife or children here, so this is maybe another little piece of evidence that Lot did find his wife and had his children while he lived in Sodom. Maybe not, but there's no mention of them here. And then you have this scene after this happens in the back part of chapter 14, this interaction between Abram and the king of Sodom and this priest named Melchizedek, who was the priest of the God Most High and the king of Salem, if you look down in verse 17 and following. I don't necessarily want to get into all of that. There's a very interesting study to be had about Melchizedek. I think Caleb may have dealt with this recently, so you can look that up if you want to. But here's what we want to talk about. Abram shows his faith in God by giving Melchizedek what? 1/10 of everything. Okay, so there's this concept of tithing coming up very, very early on in Scripture between people and priests and God. And he gives this to Melchizedek, and what does he think about the spoils of war? The king of Sodom says, you can keep all the stuff, but just give me all the people back. And what does Abram say about that? Does he take all of that stuff? Why? Because he said he wouldn't. Who did he tell that he wouldn't? He told God that I'm not going to take the spoils of war. He made a promise to God. So these promises, they're going both ways now. He says, I've raised my hand to the Lord that I wouldn't take any of this. And there's another reason that Abram gives. What's the other reason? He doesn't want anybody to be able to say that they made him rich. It seems, if we're reading between the lines a little bit, Abram wants everyone to know where his blessings come from. Is that what you might think about that? Abram is very much God's man, and his faith in God is strong, and he doesn't want anybody to say, well, I made Abram rich. So he just turns down all of this stuff. Now the men who went with him and helped him, he doesn't speak for them. But this is a very interesting segment in Abram's life where his faith seems to be very strong and he is making and keeping promises to God. Okay, so when we get to chapter 15, it says, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. I have no idea how long that refers to. Do you? I have no clue how long after these things God appeared to Abram. But evidently, based on the first thing that God says to Abram, which is what? Fear not. Did you know that this is one of the most often repeated phrases and commands in all of Scripture for God to say, don't be afraid? Jesus said it quite a bit. It's one of the most often repeated statements in the Bible, and this is the first time that it comes up. This is the first time God says it. Don't be afraid, Abram. And so if God is saying to Abram, fear not, don't be afraid, what does that mean about Abram in this setting here? Probably there's some fear. Okay, there's some kind of fear going on with Abram, and there's a lot of, I guess, theories about what Abram might have been afraid of, but none of them really make any sense except the fear and the doubt that might be coming because what has still not happened. You know, I'm winning my wars, I've got all the blessings I could possibly want, but John, what would you say? The child has not yet come. And you're going to see this is Abram's fear, I think, as you keep reading here. He's afraid, he's doubting. God says, I am your shield, your reward shall be very great. I think God chose His words very carefully because the shield part, He's experiencing that, isn't He? He just took 318 men and was successful against the armies of 4 kings. He's experiencing God as a shield. He's experiencing God as a reward, physically speaking, isn't he? He's got all kinds of stuff that he never had before, that he never planned on having, that clearly came from God. And so God might be kind of pulling something else out of Abram here. Don't be afraid. I'm going to be your shield. Your reward is going to be great. And Abram says something here. Abram responds because God's trying to encourage him. And what's Abram's response? Somebody read verse 2 and 3.
But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir.
Okay. So this seems to be what's on Abram's mind. God is coming back to Abram. He wants to encourage him not to be afraid, but Abram says, what is it that you're going to give me? Because the one thing that you promised that I'm really concerned about has not happened. Thanks for all the other things, maybe he's thinking, that you've done for me and given me, but this is the big deal, and it just hasn't happened yet. And this Eliezer of Damascus that I have brought into my family and probably legally made my heir, I've found somebody to make the heir if anything happens to me. There won't be nobody. But, that's what it's looking like it's going to be, is this Eliezer person, who's not really my child, is going to be my heir. Now, I think it's a bold thing to say this kind of thing to God, don't you? It's a little bit bold, but Abram does it. And I want you to notice that before we look at God's actual response to Abram's question and statement and doubt and fear, what does He not do? What could, has any of your children ever questioned you?
He doesn't reprimand him.
Okay. I've reprimanded a few children for questioning me after I've told them a thing or two more than once, haven't you? Like if I tell you to do something, or if I tell you I'm going to do something, like have you ever told your kid, I'm going to buy you something today? Boy, don't ever say that unless you're about to buy that thing in the next 30 seconds. Don't ever make that promise, because all you're going to hear until they get it is, when are we going to go get that? Are we going to the store? Is this it? Is this the time? I mean, constantly that's what children do. And so Abram is doing that. God, I mean, I understand you're making this promise and you're trying to encourage me, but where's the child? Where is he? You've not given me anybody. And God could have said, how dare you? I told you what I was going to do. I've renewed this promise to you at least 2 times that we can read about. How dare you question me? There's nothing like that. There's no reprimand. God is not angry with Abram. In fact, I would suggest to you, based on how God began this conversation, that this is exactly why He appeared to Abram. He knew he was doubting. He knew he was afraid. This is exactly why we're having this conversation. So look at chapter 15, beginning in verse 4. And somebody read 4 through 8.
And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, look toward the heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord, how am I to know that I shall possess it?
Okay, so let's take this a little bit at a time. Instead of reprimanding or getting angry with Abram when he has this doubt and this question, God, again, renews His promise with more specificity than He has before. Abram has thought all this time, well, maybe I'm going to have to bring somebody into my family, and maybe that's how God will give me a son. God says, no, I'm not doing it that way. You'll have a son from your own body. What will come out of your own loins is what the Hebrew actually means, your own flesh and blood. Let me be more clear if that's what you need me to be. And so up to this point, if you go back to verse 1, this has been a vision. God's appearing to Abram in a vision. But verse 5 says what? What did God do in verse 5? Are we still having a vision in verse 5? No, God has woken him up, brought him outside, and said, I want you to look up. Look toward heaven and try to count all those stars if you can. That's how many offspring you're going to have. So he, again, just like he did when he had him walk the land, come on outside, let me show you something from your world. The world you live in, this is how many offspring you're going to have. I want this to be as observable and relatable and real to you as it can be, that I am going to keep my promise. Okay? We have compared your offspring to the dust of the earth, and now we're comparing them to the stars in the sky. And God probably has more ways to illustrate this, but these are 2 pretty good ones, aren't they, Caleb?
I think one thing he's doing there is there's a little bit of subtext that's unspoken. When he goes out and shows him something in creation, there's sort of a proof there too, kind of like we see from Romans 1, like, I made all of this. I can take care of you having an error.
Good point. Good point. So what is Abram's response to this? In verse number 6. Well, let's not get there yet. We will get there. He believed. Okay? He believed the Lord. And again, this is interesting. I didn't know this. This is the first time in the whole Bible that the verb believe, or its noun form, faith, appears in the Bible. Now, it's not the first time Abram had faith, is it? No, we know that he's on a journey of faith. That began many years ago when God called him out of Ur. It was renewed when he called him out of Haran, but this affirmation that Abraham believed in the Lord, what it suggests here, according to some scholars, is a more decisive faith. Meaning that Abram is deciding here to trust not just in the promises of God, but in God. Now that's a subtle but very important difference, isn't it? Because here's what happens in our earthly experience. There are promises we want to believe because we like the promise. Are you with me? We get somebody promises us something and it doesn't really matter who they are. We sure hope that happens because we want that. Maybe you've been promised things. I used to get these things in the mail that you have won, You've won millions of dollars. All you have to do is give us your bank account, whatever they did. We want to believe some things. And we're disappointed over and over again, and sometimes because of that, we begin to view the source of that promise as unreliable. But what's happening here apparently is that God has made so many promises to Abram, and he has come through so many times, that when he renews this one this time, Abram has decided, here, I am just going to trust in God Himself. Maybe this is where he resigns himself to the idea that maybe this is going to take a while. But I'm going to trust the God that's making these promises and not hang so much of my hope on the promise itself. Does that make sense? I'm going to share a brief story because I think it's helpful. When we lived in Northport, I met a guy, and I'm going to make this as short as possible. I met a guy that I did not really know. He was a mutual friend. And we got to know each other, and he ended up making some promises to me and my family. Financial promises. He told this story about inheriting this piece of land and property, and he was going to sell it and make millions of dollars, billions of dollars, maybe selling it to Walmart and all these different places, and it all sounded very real. And, the more we became friends, the bigger his promises got. And to the point where he was, hold on to your seat here, he was promising me and my family millions of dollars. Okay? I don't know if you've ever had this happen, but let me tell you something. If you ever do have this happen, let me tell you, you are going to have a rush of, ooh, I like that promise. And you're going to want with every part of who you are to believe that promise is going to come true, in spite of who might be making it. And so what happened over the course of several years is the promises kept being renewed and renewed. It's coming, but there was always some problem, always some setback. And here I am. You might notice I don't have millions of dollars. In fact, I have less money after meeting that guy than I did before I met him, because I never came to trust him. Because as much as I wanted to believe his promises, he didn't give me any evidence that he could be trusted. And maybe you've had somebody like that in your life. They make all these good promises, but you have no reason to believe them. And Abram does. He does have reason to believe that he can trust God. Now look at what happens to this kind of faith. What is the result of this kind of faith on Abram's part? What does God do? The very next phrase.
He reckoned it to him as righteousness.
He reckoned it to him as righteousness. Another translation will say counted to him as righteousness. Do you know what kind of word that is? If you have a bank account, you know what kind of word that is. It's going into your account. It's given to you. There's a transfer of something. Your position, your situation has changed. If this guy had ever given me the millions of dollars, he would have reckoned it to me. I set up a bank account at a credit union because he told me to, because he was going to push a button one day and reckon or count to me millions of dollars. God actually does it. God says, I see your faith, and I reckon and count it in your account as what? As righteousness. What is righteousness? What does that mean? Does that mean that Abram had done a lot of good things? I'm going to recognize all your good things. Is that what that means? No, if you go to Romans 4, this exact same event is quoted in Romans chapter 4 in the context of Paul trying to explain that, listen, you are not justified by the stuff you do, by the works that you do, by all the good things that you might do. You are reckoned by God as being righteous because of your what? Because of your faith. Now, we could talk a lot about what faith is and everything that's involved in that, and Abram's a good example of that. But it's very clear in the Old Testament and the New, if you want to be reckoned by God as being right in His sight, as having a right relationship with Him, it's going to be because of your faith. That you trust Him, that you believe Him. Now, you're going to work for Him after that, right? You're going to obey Him. You're going to do what He says. Or you're at least going to try to do what He says. But let's not make any mistake. From Abram all the way up to the New Testament, this is how you become righteous in God's sight. If you're trying to work your way there, you're going to be in trouble, aren't you, Mark?
Get off the subject, but
Oh, sure.
in line with that, Galatians chapter 3 tells us that's what ties us to Abraham. That the real children of Abraham are those that have faith. And that, like you said, ties us all the way back from today to Him. That same in verse 8 in Galatians chapter 3, that same believe God and it was counted to him as righteousness is quoted there.
Yeah.
And I think a couple more places, maybe in James too, but that's what ties us back to that promise and, us being part of those stars, I guess.
That's not off the subject at all, Mark. I don't know why you thought that it was. That's a very good point. That and nobody's talking here about a faith that doesn't do anything. We know from James that that's not a faith. The faith that doesn't do anything is not a real faith. It's dead. But when you're talking about a real biblical faith, hey, we look to God and we say, I don't just want what you can offer. I want you. I trust you. I'm not trying to just get stuff from you. I trust and I put all of my faith in you. That, well, God says, I recognize that. And I'm going to count that to your account as righteousness. So it's a very real turning point, seemingly, or it wouldn't be quoted so many times in the New Testament. It reflects his status. But see, the conversation continues. If this was the end of Abram's journey, God reckoned to his faith as righteousness, some people would say, well, I guess I'm done. There's nothing else I have to do. But the conversation continues, doesn't it? God has shored up his faith and in his ability to kind of work out the details of this promise, but then God turns his attention back to the promise of the land. Because what does Abram say after this? God says, I'm the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But what does Abram say? How am I to know that I shall possess? I thought we just said that we have faith in God now. Didn't we, one verse ago, didn't we just establish that? And haven't we quoted it 2 or 3 times in the New Testament? Why are we still asking these questions? You know and I know, don't we? Because this is what we do.
It's like a conversation.
It is.
That he's having. And so it's just a back and forth conversation. Okay, well, how am I to know?
This is the kind of question I asked this guy in Northport. Tell me, give me something. How do I know I'm going to get millions of dollars? And his answers were never really solid, like God's are. Obviously, they weren't solid at all. But this is really fascinating here because Abram's faith has been counted to him as righteousness by God, but he's still prone to the very human tendency to seek confirmation and reassurance and validation. And again, before we look at what God says, what does he not do? Same answer. We're still not mad at Abram for asking this question. We're still not upset with him. So when we begin in verse 9, this is kind of a spooky scene here. but it's important. I'm going to begin in verse 9 because I'm going to stop along the way here. He said to him, this is God's answer. How do I know that I'm going to possess the land? So God says, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought him all those, cut them in half, and laid each half over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in half. And when birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. So the picture is we've brought all these animals, we've cut them in half, and we're laying the parts facing each other with a row, a space in between. Okay, so just try to picture that. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So, before we go any further, this is mysterious and strange to us with all these animals cut in half, but it probably wasn't for Abram. This seems to have been a pretty traditional way in this culture of making or cutting a covenant, making an agreement between two people. You can see this same ceremony, if you will, in Jeremiah chapter 34. If you want to read that later on your own, you see this same exact thing with these animals cut in two. And in Jeremiah's account, the people involved in the covenant, both parties would walk through the middle of these cut animals, and that signified that if I don't do what I say I'm going to do, may I be as these animals. That's what this means. That this is how serious we're taking this. This is more than a handshake. Even one that you spit on, as gross as that is. I've never understood that. But when we walk through these dead, cut animals, we are saying to each other, I will keep this promise, or may I be in this kind of position. And so that's what God has Abram set up. But as the day goes on, there's no walking in between the animals, and Abram finally falls asleep, and that's when God makes these very specific promises. Like, I just want you to imagine here, we've got God now giving him a lot more information about the promise, right? This is stuff that you wouldn't even really need to know. But stuff that would solidify in your mind, okay, God knows what's going to happen long after I'm gone. So lots and lots of good information about his offspring, his descendants, his future. By the way, you're going to be fine. You're going to be buried in a good old age in peace. But I'm going to give your people this land. They're going to suffer for a while, but I'm going to give it to them. And I'm even going to tell you when they're going to come back and get it. Now, when the sun had gone down, verse 17, and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces, these animal pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I will give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. So who's missing from the covenant ceremony? Who do you think the smoking firepot and the flaming torch represent? That's God. God says, I'm going to walk through this and make you a covenant. Now, who didn't walk through the animals? Abram didn't. Because Abram doesn't have anything to live up to for this to happen. God says, I am making what people call a unilateral covenant with you. Everybody knows what that means. If you don't, now you do. I'm making a covenant that really only depends on one party. And parents do this all the time, right? I promise I'm going to feed you. No parent ever says, I promise I'll feed you if you do everything I say. I mean, you might say that. but you probably got a hungry kid. God says, I'm going to make a promise to you, and I know that you're doubting and questioning it, so let me give you a lot more information, and let me give you a confirmation in a way that you're very familiar with, probably. And by the way, you don't even need to walk through it. I'm going to walk through these animals, and I'm going to show you in the strongest ways possible that I am going to do what I say I'm going to do for you. So, was Abram's faith a part of this? Yes. We've already seen that it was credited to him. It was counted to him. God recognized that. But when God recognized that kind of faith, God took it even further. And God said, let me make you some promises that don't depend on you. That if you'll continue to have this kind of faith in me, this is what I'm going to do for you and your offspring long after you're gone. So was Abram's faith always going to be this strong? I mean, how strong of a faith do you think you would have if this kind of experience happened to you tonight? You have some sad animal owners somewhere, I guess, but I would think that this kind of experience you'd be on a spiritual high. Like, I will never doubt God again, right? I will never question what God has promised me again. Is that the case with Abram? Would it always be this strong? Would he always do the right thing? Would he ever doubt or fear or sin again? Yeah, he would. But let me ask a more important question. Was God ever going to break this promise? No, he can't. God can't lie. Whatever God says, and it does depend on faith to a degree, doesn't it? It does. Nobody's saying that it doesn't. But in some ways, God had made promises to Abram that Abram doesn't deserve. He can't earn. He can't rise up to God's level of whatever goodness. So this is really important as we try to make some application for ourselves this morning. And I want to hear what you have to say about this, but I want to make sure that we get at least some of these thoughts out before I get your feedback. People like us, like you, who have true and recognized and biblical and saving faith. Okay, I believe that everybody in this room has that. You have that kind of faith. You trust God, don't you? You trust Him. You've trusted Him all your life. You believe that His promises will be kept and fulfilled, and you believe that you're going to be with Him someday, that He is going to save you ultimately from your sins. You absolutely believe that. You have that kind of faith, and God has credited that to you, just as He did to Abram as righteousness. You're right in my sight if you believe in me in that way. But even people of faith have feelings, don't they? They have emotions, they have doubts, they have stubbornness, they have fear. They have insecurities and weaknesses and anxieties and failings. And I want to read this quote from a commentator because I thought this was really interesting. He said this, because of the excesses in emotionalism, and I think he's talking about in the religious world, because of the excesses in emotionalism, and this was written by a member of the church, we may have a tendency at times to go to the opposite extreme and try to view Christianity as a matter of intellect and will. We may be suspicious of all emotions. This attitude may cause people to feel guilty or insecure when they experience doubts, fears, depression. But God is a loving Heavenly Father, and you can see it here, and wants us to have an honest relationship with Him, sharing our burdens and anxieties. I think that's beautiful, don't you? I think that's true. I think we have to be very careful that we don't have a vision and a version of God in our mind that He can't handle the way that we feel right now. He can't, if we have a question or a fear or a doubt, you better hide that. You better not bring that to God or you're in big trouble. That's just not what we see. That's not the God that dealt with Abram, and this is the same God. So let me ask the question, which of God's promises do you doubt the most or the most often? For me, it's really easy. It's salvation. And I'm ashamed of it. But I doubt it more than most promises because I'm so up and down. And it's my human tendency to think that when I'm down, I don't deserve that. And that's a real struggle for me. And I know what the Bible says about having confidence in my salvation. I'm working on it, aren't you? I understand that it's a true thing. But as a human being who has faith, I'm just like Abram in a lot of ways, and maybe you are too. We have emotions. And we struggle to accept the ins and outs and the intricacies of God's promises. Which of those promises do you tend to struggle with most, to comprehend, to accept, to believe, or to live in assurance of? Think about that. Because the passage of time and the circumstances of life can often do to us what they did to Abram when it comes to God's promises. But what do those things, the passage of time and the circumstances of life, what do they do to God's actual promise? Nothing. They don't change it at all. Now, if I turn my back on God, I don't have faith anymore, or my faith is not working itself out in my life anymore, well, I've changed the situation. But that's not what we're talking about. Go to Hebrews chapter 6, and we'll close with this. Hebrews chapter 6. There's a problem for the audience of this letter, that they were going to turn their back on the gospel and go back into Judaism. And the writer is really trying to keep them from doing that, and he's explaining the consequences of that. But look in verse 9. Though we speak in this way, yet in your case, beloved, we feel sure of better things. Things that belong to salvation. For God is not unjust so as to overlook your work and the love that you have shown for His name in serving the saints, as you still do. And we desire each one of you to show the same earnestness, to have the full assurance of hope until the end, so that you may not be sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. Now listen to this part. This is where we connect. For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, surely I will bless you and multiply you. And thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. For people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all their disputes an oath is final for confirmation. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of His purpose, He guaranteed it with an oath. So that by two unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. You can see all the connections between the passage we just looked at and this, can't you? It may be a reference to the very event that we just looked at in chapter 15. And the point is, if God makes you a promise and you have faith in Him, your faith is going to go up and down. Your faith is going to be stronger, weaker. You have to have it. But your faith doesn't have to be as strong as God's promise, because it can never be. God's promise is sure, especially this idea of salvation is sure, it's certain. We have guarantees of it in the Spirit, we're told. And so, when we're talking about God's promises, and I apologize I didn't get a chance to get more feedback, but I really wanted to deliver this message to you this morning because it's so powerful that when God gives you a promise, believe it. And if you question it, if you doubt it, that's okay. Take that to Him. Look for confirmation in His Word. You'll find it. Every single time you'll find it. So don't struggle so much with the promises of God that you become discouraged or that you begin to doubt or fear the things that God has promised. And also, when you make a promise to God, if at all possible, keep it. That's the kind of faith we should have. But He'll never break one of His to us. Thank you all so much for being here this morning, and I hope this was a blessing to you.